Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Journey Journals. My name is Gaia from Life of Gaia, and today we are going to be taking a journey into the profound world of journaling and leaving a lasting legacy. And my guest today is distinguished author Merle Saferstein. Now, Merle started journaling in 1974 and ended up writing a total of 359 journals. She then took 14 years to distill the contents of these journals into two books that she has recently published called Living and Leaving My Legacy, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Her books have inspired many others to embark on similar journeys of self-transformation. And so today it is my pleasure to introduce you to Merle. Welcome, Merle.
Thank you, Gaia. I'm thrilled to be here.
Merle, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your background before we get started with the questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I began my career as an educator. So I started by teaching elementary school, and I did that for 5 years, almost 5 years. And then I, at some point, was a nursery school teacher, preschool. And then I directed a preschool. I directed a day camp with 350 campers. And at some point, I quit working and wrote a novel. This was a long time ago in the early 80s. And then I got into Holocaust education. And my career was basically, the majority of the rest of my career was in Holocaust education. I was the director of educational outreach at a Holocaust center in South Florida. And so I did that for 26 years. And then when I retired, I developed a course called Living and Leaving Your Legacy, and have been teaching ever since. So I've taught actually 68 6 to 8 week classes since then.
Well, you started your journaling journey in 1974. Could you tell us what prompted you to start journaling and how it's evolved over the years?
Actually, I had taken a course at Miami-Dade College, and it was a Gestalt class, and we had to keep a notebook, and it was basically a dream log. And I had filled half of it. At the time, my children were very young. So in 74, they were a year and 3 years old. They're 18 months apart. And we had moved to Florida a few years before that, but I was really kind of lost in terms of not having a lot of friends and not having a community at that point. And honestly, while at the time I didn't admit it to anyone, it was really hard to be a stay-at-home mother. I loved my children, but I felt like I needed more. And I think I was frustrated. And so I began just one day, right before my 30th birthday, I picked up a pen and I took out that was actually a stenographer's notebook and started writing. And so that was my very first journal entry. And I wrote for probably about 7 years periodically. I would just once in a while just pick up my pen and start writing. In 1982 is when I became a serious journaler. And so from probably 74 till 82, I had maybe filled 12 journals. And then from then on is when I was writing almost daily, and then definitely daily and sometimes multiple times a day.
Incredible. And Merle, as far as consistency goes, because I mean, being a mom is almost a full-time job in and of itself. How did you maintain consistency with your journal writing and your practice for what was decades? Because I find with myself, I keep a gratitude journal and I do a fair amount of journaling, but there are a lot of times that I fall off and spaces in between. What did you do to maintain the consistency?
That's never been an issue for me. Actually, I've often wondered if my journaling was an obsession, whether it's a compulsion. I never really understood my great need to journal, but never once have I fallen off in terms of not being able to do it. It's just something that has become such an important part of my life. In fact, in one of the interviews, an interviewer asked me the question, what would my life be like if I didn't journal? And I stopped and thought about it. And I said, I can't even answer that question because I can't even conceive of not. So I think for me, it's just something that's very much a part of my life and not something that I have to think about doing. I just, more since I worked on this project and went through my journals, I don't write as much as I used to in terms of the recording of my daily life. It's much more now. I go to the page when I really have to work through something or something profound has happened that I want to record. I'm not writing the same way that I used to.
Interesting. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, because I realized that I had so much in my journals that I really didn't need, that I didn't need to say. So for example, early on, I would write how much I jogged every day or what I weighed or little things, just the day-to-day picky things. I don't need to do that anymore. That's not really what, and having gone through all my journals and read them, I realized that really what I was interested in is what are the things of substance that I put in my journals.
Interesting. So it was a distilling of sorts, even in the process itself.
Right.
Incredible. So Merle, you journaled from 1974 to 2016, which is, 42-year time span. And then you took 14 years to review the 354 journals that you had written, which must have been quite an emotional journey in and of itself. Can you share some of the challenges or the breakthroughs that you experienced during the process?
It was definitely a journey. And one of the things that happened when I started doing this, my husband could not figure out why I was doing it. And he said to me, does this mean that when you go back to a time in our life when you were angry with me, that you're going to be angry with me all over again? And I said, well, let's wait and see. And then one day he walked in from the office and I was ready to kill him. And he said, okay, I get it now. He couldn't figure out why I would put myself in the position of going back to some of the more difficult times. For me, it was a way to really better understand what my life was, to see where I would plant a seed and watch it grow, which fascinated me completely. I think that just doing this really helped me to step back away from my life. And one of the things that I always wondered about was, is there anything in there worth sharing? And I kept saying to myself, as an educator, you have to have said something in 359 journals that's worth passing along. But I had no idea really. And so for me, it was really searching. And I looked at my journals as a tapestry. And then when I decided to take excerpts according to different subjects, I looked at each subject as a thread in that tapestry. And so it was fascinating for me to separate the different excerpts according to topics and then look at them and see, without anything around them besides just the topic itself. And so I think that it made it wasn't distilled anymore. It was just really there and became something really significant.
And as part of the distillation process and the condensing, did you come across any surprising revelations or insights, particularly about yourself and your life while you were doing this condensing?
Well, a few things happened. One thing was that I always thought that and I still do believe that I'm a very positive person. And I often thought that my journals were filled with mostly positive, where most people journal when things are bad. I just figured that wasn't going to be the case. And it was shocking to me to see how much was negative. What I learned as a result of that by reading that was seeing how I took a negative experience and I worked through it to bring it to a positive point. And for me, that was huge. That really became a really eye-opening to see that piece of it. I think that for me, that was probably the biggest thing. There were no surprises, except that I saw that who I am is who I have always been. And while my behaviors have changed, basically the basic person is still the same. And early on, I knew my purpose in life. I saw that I had written about that in the 80s, and it was shocking to me, really. I didn't realize that I was so clear about my direction and what it was that I wanted to accomplish.
Merle, as part of this, discovering these revelations, like you're, noticing the negativity and reframing it into positivity, were you able to notice any other reoccurring themes or patterns that started, coming up or being a thread throughout these journals that provided a sort of even deeper understanding of your life's purpose and values?
There were patterns. I mean, some of the subjects, for example, just seeing how I related to people and the idea of connection, and seeing how early on connection was so important to me, and it continued to be that, or my commitment to my marriage and what that meant. Watching my children grow and seeing how my role as a parent changed through the years was also really interesting and important to me. For me, I think the biggest thing was that I had a record of so much of what I had done in my life. And so to be able to just see that, I mean, very few people, we think we're going to remember. And I think that a lot of people do remember, but you don't remember the details the way you thought. What was interesting to me was I realized that my memory is far better than it would have been if I didn't write. But I am convinced that because I wrote, there were very few things when I went back that were a surprise to me or that I didn't remember. Every once in a while, maybe I'd say three incidents where I said, that is not the way I remember it. Other than that, there was almost nothing that wasn't the way I remembered it to be. And I think that that's pretty interesting. At least for me, it was. And I realize even now when I go to a lecture, I always write as the person's talking. And it is the way that I process and remember.
Thank you, Merle. I wanted to touch on the question of vulnerability and privacy when sharing your personal journals. Now, for example, I do a lot of journaling after journeys, and I don't write it, but I type it on the computer. And they are so personal to me that the only way that I will share them with someone is doing a screen share, letting them read it, and then that's it. It doesn't get sent to anyone. It doesn't get shared with anyone. And for very specific reasons, because they're very, personal pieces for me. Sometimes people mention situations, and so I'm very reluctant to share them, and very, very sort of mindful of who I share them with and allow to read them. Now, you sort of transformed the contents of or parts of your journals into 2 published books. And I wanted to ask you how do you maintain that balance between vulnerability, privacy, and sharing your own personal experiences and maybe even people that were mentioned, along the way?
It was a huge piece to all this. So first of all, I had a lot of self-doubt. It was like, why would anyone even want to read this? Although I knew that I had 2 goals in writing the book. One was that I wanted to help people understand the benefits of journaling. The second one was to look at my life as a mirror into their own life. That something that I would write might spark a thought, an idea, a memory for someone else. That being said, I have always written in my journals for my eyes only. And I've known all along that part of the reason I decided to do this was because I knew that I couldn't share my journals. There came a point at which I always used to think I would leave them for my children. And then one day I said, you know what, after back and forth, I can't, because there are things in there that I would not want anyone to see. And people shared their secrets with me, their confidences, and I would process them in my journals, and that would be betraying them. Basically, what I was feeling was that I took out the excerpts, both good and bad, and things that I knew that I was not going to share, but I wasn't ready to put away for good. And I don't know that I'll ever read my journals again, although I hope I will. So I took them all out. So any given topic could have 75 to 450 single-space typewritten pages by the time I finished this project. And when I put the topics, when I chose the excerpts, for the most part, I chose the positive ones. So I have a friend who is a mutual friend of ours, who's a psychologist, who kept saying to me, you need to include the shadow side. And I heard her, and I thought, I know I do. And so there were some things that I would include, but for the most part, I really wasn't sure that I was ready to do that. And then one day I went through, after I finished the chapter on marriage, I went through it and I thought, this is really lovely. It's fluffy, it's wonderful, but people, it's not realistic. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go back to those 450 pages of excerpts and I'm going to pull out some of the tough stuff. And I took a big gulp and I just started. And I started pulling out stuff that I did not expect that I would share, and felt very vulnerable, but also knew that if I wanted people to be able to relate and to look inside themselves, I was going to have to share that piece. And so I did. And then I went back and started doing that with all the chapters. In terms of people's names, there were times that there were stories I wanted to tell because there was a point I wanted to make, but I knew that I did not want to expose them. So for the most part, I would either give the person a different name. There were times I changed gender totally so that it would not make sense. One of my friends yesterday called me. She was reading the book and she said, I know this paragraph is about my ex-husband. And I'm like, actually, it's not. But it was interesting to hear her say that. So I would say that by the time I put this book out, the two books out there, I was ready. But there are times that I kind of think I can hardly believe that I've done this. It's really, in journaling, one of the things I always say to people is there are two rules. One is to put the date and the year always, and the other is to not censor yourself. And there are times that I will be thinking something and think, I can hardly believe I'm going to commit this to paper. And yet that's the promise I made myself. If I stop, then I'm going to not allow myself to journal. So that's a long answer to that question.
But really the perfect answer. And I feel like there's such a huge payoff to those acts of bravery and willing to, the willingness to be vulnerable. And as you said, the moment that you took that gulp and decided to sort of address the shadow side. And really, this channel was started to look at those particular journeys, and it came from a quote by Joseph Campbell where the cave that you fear to enter holds the jewels that you seek. And so I've had the privilege of interviewing so many people who have had the courage and the bravery to take the step into that cave the same way that you did. And I find that the payoff for it afterwards is incredible because people really connect to that vulnerability and that courage to be open and sort of be with what's so that was amazing. Which Merle, that brings me to the next question. This channel is a lot around plant medicine ceremonies and the journeys and the shadow work that they bring you in front of. And one of the biggest components around these journeys is a lot of journaling that happens with the intention setting before the journey. And then there's a lot of journaling after with the integration portion of it, and writing down what the experience was and being with the experience and processing it. I wanted to ask you, what is the importance of journaling to you?
There's so many benefits to journaling. I think probably the most important is it's really helped me to know who I am. And I remember years ago in the mid 80s, I went for therapy for a short time. And my therapist said to me, she had never met anyone who knows yourself as well as I do. And I know that that's the result of having written. And I do say it all in my journal, and I really do explore my thoughts and my feelings. It's also a great way for me to process. If I'm going through a difficult time, the journal is the place that I can really do that. Also, I am of the firm belief that, like, when we have a cluttered house, our minds are not free. When I have a lot going on and so much going through my head, writing it down really clears me and frees me to be a better self. So I think that, and it's just self-care. I mean, I believe that taking the time to record what I'm thinking and feeling makes such a difference in my life.
Well, I wanted to ask you before we get on to the next question, is via email, we had a little exchange where you pointed out a very, very important distinction to me, which was a opportunity for learning for me. I learned something new, which I very much appreciate. And that is the difference between journaling and leaving a legacy. Would you mind taking a moment to explain that, please?
Sure. So journaling is personally for myself. Legacy journaling, which is something that I labeled several years ago when I started doing this project. What I realized is that a legacy journal is something, it's from a journal, but it's for someone else. So my journaling was definitely for myself. When I embarked on this project, I considered it a legacy journal. So I have taken from my journals things that I want to pass along. And I didn't write them intentionally for that reason, but then I decided that this is something that will hopefully benefit someone else. And so that, I think that's really the distinction, is writing for someone. So for example, when both of my granddaughters were born, on the day that they were born, I started writing a journal to each one of them. And I have been doing that ever since. And so the oldest one is now a senior in college. I finished one journal and have started another one. And the other one is a senior in high school. And those journals, I went back at one point and just started, just one day, opened up some pages. And they're filled with so much love. And every time I was with the girls, I've been with the girls, I would write in my journal. So I would write about the things we did together, how I felt. And I thought to myself, this someday will be such a great gift for them if they can read cursive, which could be a problem. We've discussed that before. But I really do believe that I'm giving them a gift, which I consider a legacy journal.
So, Merle, they haven't read the journals yet?
No, my daughter-in-law keeps asking me when I'm giving them to the girls, and I'm like, when I'm ready. I'm clearly not ready to do that yet.
Oh, how interesting to write journals for and about someone else. I think that's an incredible idea. And speaking of incredible ideas, what advice would you give to someone who's just about to start embarking on a journaling journey or, leaving a legacy? What could you say to them?
Well, for someone who wants to just journal, to start journaling, I always say to start in the moment. So people say, I don't know, some people write with prompts, they need prompts, other people have no idea how to start. I always start this way. Right now I'm thinking, or right now I'm feeling. So it's just being present in the moment. And I think that's one of the gifts of journaling. It really helps us to be in the present. In terms of leaving a legacy, that's a whole other conversation in terms of what to do. But I will just say this about legacy. How we live our life becomes our legacy. And so even if one doesn't do anything else, just the way we live, people watch us and learn from us. And so if one even has any thoughts about leaving a legacy, I say, then live your life the way you want to be remembered, because that's exactly what's going to happen.
Merle, could you tell us a little bit about your two books? I personally own your first volume one, and I was at one of your book signings, which was an honor to be at, and one of your interviews, which I loved. And I would love for you to explain a little bit about volume one and volume two, please.
Love to. What I did basically was I took these excerpts based on originally 70 different topics. So it was a huge project. And like you had said earlier, it took 14 years. So actually I spent 14 years off and on going through my journals and taking excerpts according to different subjects. And at one point I thought that I would publish them both together as a collection. And my publisher was the one who said, no, do them separately. But what I ended up doing was I put them all together. And then at some point when she said that, I divided them into two different volumes. So the first volume is as it turns out, and I didn't really consciously plan this, but I would say the first volume is more about my earlier years, even though in both volumes, the different subjects might go from 1974 to 2016. I mean, there are some that are just specific time, but generally they do that. So for example, in the first volume, there are things on being a woman. In the 60s, I became a feminist, and so there's some of that history on marriage, on parenting, on spirituality. I was always just kind of in search of trying to figure out what it all meant. In the first volume, I also had taken 3 months and went to the beach, and it was really the precursor to this, where I took some journals and started taking excerpts, and I ended up writing a book in 1994 from about 30 journals. But what I did then was they were very superficial. When I went back and started looking at them to think they'd be the foundation for this, I said, no, I have to go back all the way, because I was not willing at that point to expose anything that wasn't just positive and wonderful. So that's the first book. One of the things that I have in this book is journal prompts after each chapter. And that was actually suggested to me by someone in one of my classes who said, you should ask questions at the end. And so, of course, questions to me were journal prompts. And then I thought, well, that brings the reader in a way that the reader might not necessarily be as involved. And then the other thing that I do at the end of each chapter is write a reflection. And those reflections are something that I often say in my journaling circles. I suggest to people at the very end to go back and read what they've written that day and reflect on it. And so because I finished this in 2016, but didn't publish the first one until 2022, that was a 6-year period that I could reflect on. So things, for example, my marriage changed in 6 years. And so I would reflect on what I wrote, what I've now, and then sometimes fill in the gaps, because there were things that happened between, the end of the 2016 and current. The second volume is clearly, in my mind, a more serious volume in terms of the material. And it really, a lot of it is based on my last 10 years since I retired from the Holocaust Center. So for example, I have one subject is relationships. Another is on death and dying. I've done a lot of hospice work and work with people at the end of their life. So there's that. I have one chapter that is it's called Those Who Are There. And that's 48 vignettes of Holocaust survivors that I've worked with through the years. There's a chapter on legacy, and that chapter is basically, at the end, I have a list of projects that adults can do, that children can do if they've lost a loved one. I have how to write an ethical will, which is a spiritual document that contains our life lessons, our values and beliefs. So in a way, it's kind of like a manual in terms of giving people hands-on things that they can do.
Like a manual for life.
Right.
Love it. Merle, quick question, just circling back to the questions, the journal prompts, and some of the reflections that you've put at the end of each chapter of your first book. Would you mind sharing one or two of them with us that stand out or that you remember?
Of the prompts?
Mm-hmm.
One of the chapters, the chapter on being a woman, I was really interested in, for example, how a man would react and what a man might think. So I don't offhand remember the exact prompts, but I know that was something that I questioned. In the marriage piece, I also talked about relationships in terms of, you don't have to be married, you can just be in a relationship and answer some of the questions. So to look at those kinds of things. In the Holocaust chapter, the Holocaust survivors, I asked the question, have you ever met a Holocaust survivor, and what impact did it have on your life? So it's those kinds of things. Basically, when I was going through and editing, I would form the questions as I was going through it. So it was really very organic in terms of how they came to be.
And Merle, these volume one and volume two of Living and Leaving Your Legacy are not your first two books. You had actually written one book prior to those. So would you mind telling us a little bit about that book? And also the question that I've heard people ask you before is there going to be a fourth book of some sorts, which I know at the time there was no answer, but maybe something has changed in the meantime.
Okay. I actually have a few books that are sitting on a shelf that I've written that will probably never see the light of day. I tried, I sent them to publishers and agents and whatever. But the book that I wrote in 2012, so when I retired from the Holocaust Center, I wrote a book that I had been thinking about writing since 1985, and it's called Room 732. And it takes place in the Hollywood Beach Hotel, which is on Hollywood Beach in South Florida. And it was a hotel that was built in 1926 and it has a very rich history. And I was kind of fascinated. We moved down here in the early 70s when it was a Bible college. And we would bring our kids to the beach, and the students from the Bible college would be walking up and down the beach proselytizing. And so I became kind of fascinated with that. And so what I did was I decided to divide the book into chapters based on the different history of the hotel itself. So it was first an upscale hotel for very wealthy people. Then it was during the war, it became a naval indoctrination and training center. And then it went back to being a nice hotel. And then it was the Bible college. And so it's had a really rich history. And so what I did was I incorporated the history and wrote short stories, fiction, which I have no idea where I came to write fiction because it's just not really something I would think I would be doing. And all the stories take place in room 732. So during the different periods, I've often walked into a hotel room and thought, I wonder who was here before. And so this was just kind of my way of playing out that fantasy. And it was fun. It was a really fun book to write. I wrote it the first draft was finished in like 2.5 months, done, ready to go. I ended up going to the hotel and staying in room 732 and going through the first draft and starting the editing process. And that book I self-published. I was determined. I was 67. I turned 67 at the time and decided that I did not want to wait to try to get an agent. It's not so easy. And so I decided, and self-publishing was just starting to happen. And it was a great experience for me.
Incredible.
And
And book number four?
and now to answer your question, is there another book coming? I actually thought that I would do a volume 3 for my journals. But what ended up happening as I started going through them, I realized that things were a little too close to my life. And I really wasn't ready to expose some of the things. So I decided, I put it aside. I went through about 3 or 4 journals because I now have 380 and just knew that this was not the time. And the other book that I had always thought I would write would be a book with my friend Tom about our friendship. And that book, I was sure I was going to write. And then when he died in October of last year, I don't know, something changed. And I realized that I've really told Tom's and my story throughout. It's laced throughout both my books. And so I don't have the same need to do that as I did before. Right now, I'm kind of looking at the freedom of not writing, not editing, not going through that whole process. I don't know, but I will keep journaling for sure.
Merle, what is your message to the world around legacy?
Probably what I said before, that how you live your life becomes your legacy. And I think that that is such an important thing to think about. We don't necessarily think that. We just think, people, some people are conscious about their financial legacy they're going to leave. Some people specifically write something. But really, I think when I think about the people in my life, I don't think about what they left me in a material sense. I think about who they were in my life and who they were as human beings.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And you have been and continue to be an absolutely exceptional human being in my eyes. And I would like to thank you for being here with me today. And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge you because Merle, I feel you are an absolute powerhouse in every sense of the word. And, I see you doing things like 12 interviews in one day, which is just astounding to me. But not only that, I find you to be so inspiring. I thank you for the insights that you've provided during this interview. And I would also like to thank and acknowledge you for being an educator for all those years at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center, and for your important work done in hospice. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure to speak with you.
Likewise, Merle. And for those of you who have enjoyed the interview, as always, please feel free to like, subscribe. If you have questions for Merle, please put them in the comments below. We'll also be putting links to Merle's website, her books, where you can purchase them. Again, if you have any questions for her. And as you've probably noticed, she has led a fascinating life and continues to. And we are going to be doing 2 other interviews with Merle. One around legacy and leaving your legacy, and we're going to be discussing the courses that she holds, and another one about her time as an educator at the Holocaust Documentation and Education Center. So if you would like to join us again, please like and subscribe, and we'd love to have you back with us. Thank you.